I am a ticket collector on a train that runs an unusual route, a ghostly journey with no passengers. But tonight, there is someone on board. Part 1. The route between Grey Castle and St. Joseph Stand has always been empty. If there were any passengers left on the train when we reached Grey Castle station, they would all get off. No exceptions, no one would ever board. It was that simple. Sometimes, occasionally, a few new passengers would board when we arrived at St. Joseph Stand. But that was just a tiny station in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by fields and gray-green weeds. A dilapidated church silently watched the trains pass and stop. Those trains were few and far between. The journey lasted about an hour. It took us quite far off course, and there was never anyone on the train. Never. No one boarded at Grey Castle. No one got off at St. Joseph's Stand. Frankly, I don't even understand why we still operate this route, to be honest, but we still run the train regardless. Twice a week, every week. We'd peel off the main line that ran between cities, delve deep into the countryside, and then let the last passengers disembark at Grey Castle. Sometimes, if it was an exceptionally busy night, we'd pick up a few new passengers at St. Joseph's Stand. But absolutely no one would ever board or alight between the two stations. It was a ghostly ride. I've been a ticket collector for 3 years now. It's all right, I guess. Before this, I used to be a television editor. That was my true passion. I worked incredibly hard to get into the profession, but honestly, I couldn't handle the pressure. For months on end, it was live show after live show. The editing had to be done on the same day for broadcast the next. I let everything overwhelm me. Sadly, that's what happened. Being a ticket collector, collecting tickets from passengers, holds no excitement. But the pressure is relatively light, so it felt like a change of pace, I think. As usual on this route, everything was quiet, peaceful. Late at night, there was no one to collect tickets from, so I'd often sit down somewhere and look at my phone. Every time I took this route, every time I ran from Grey Castle to St. Joseph's Stand, I'd try to muster up the courage to call my daughter. Since the divorce, I hadn't had a single decent conversation with her. I just wanted to tell her I loved her, wanted to ask if she wanted to see me, but I couldn't think of a way to start without it feeling awkward. Me calling suddenly like this, and then I'd just stare at my phone. Today was no exception. I bitterly continued this small, melancholic tradition. Time passed, and like clockwork, I always ended up deciding it was too late. I'd tell myself, next time I'll try again. Next time. Sometimes I'd read a book at this hour or listen to a podcast. We still had about 40 minutes before we reached Grey Castle. I stretched. I was so tired tonight, I couldn't afford to doze off at work. So I stood up, twisted my back with a crack, and stretched my knees to get the blood flowing better. I turned and walked slowly through the empty carriage, stopping for a moment, leaning my hands on the seat in front to look out the window. Outside were dark, sleeping hills, clusters of trees, and low, rust-green mountain ranges slowly drifting past. My eyes gradually lost focus, and I suddenly realized I was looking at my own reflection. We stared at each other for quite a while, then both let out a sigh. I rubbed my tired eyes. I continued walking, pressed the button to open the sliding door, and stepped into the next carriage. I immediately froze. Damn it, there was a passenger in this carriage. I stared at the man, unable to believe my eyes. There was actually a passenger, a real flesh-and-blood passenger. He was sitting alone in a 4-seat arrangement, 2 seats facing forward, 2 facing each other with a table in between. His eyes were fixed on the window. I almost couldn't believe what I was seeing. What a shock. Wait until my colleagues hear about this. Even my predecessor, how long did he run this route? 5 years, I think. He himself said he'd never seen a single passenger, not once, on this Grey Castle to St. Joseph's Stand stretch. And now there was a man sitting here, clearly right before my eyes. I chuckled and shook my head. It was strange how something so utterly mundane, in the grand scheme of things, could excite me so much. I walked towards the man, my ticket puncher ready in my hand. He glanced at me with an agitated, startled look, and suddenly my mood plummeted uncontrollably. There was something about this man that sent shivers down my spine. I stopped, scanning the empty carriage. The gloomy scenery, the flickering dim bulb at the end of the carriage, was no longer merely annoying but became chillingly frightening. There was no sound other than the gentle click-clack of the train wheels on the tracks below. I turned back to look at the man. He was restless, drenched in sweat. Perhaps he was an addict. Part of me wanted to turn away immediately. Maybe I should. After all, this was just a train line that never had anyone on it. Maybe he couldn't afford a ticket. Maybe I should just let him go, but I had to know why he was here. I absolutely had to know. He must have a reason. No one had ever been here, not once. Why was he appearing now? So I cautiously approached. I cleared my throat, surprised by my sudden nervousness. I wasn't usually the most confident person, but this was my job. Damn it. Where was this irrational fear coming from? But it wasn't irrational. It was urgent, it was sharp, it was pressing. And I suddenly wondered if I had made a serious mistake by deciding to approach this man in this dark carriage. But it was too late. I had already started to speak. "Excuse me, sir," I said, trying to keep my voice friendly. "This train rarely has passengers. I just wanted to ask." I had intended to ask if he could share some information about his journey, but my voice caught, my mouth dry. The man replied after a moment, but with extreme agitation. He cowered against the window, his eyes reflecting pure terror, one hand clutching the front of his jacket. I took a step back and suddenly noticed something carved into the back of his hand. It was a symbol, carved directly into his skin. It was then that I realized I had indeed made a terrible mistake by deciding to talk to him, but it was too late. The symbol looked like an uppercase R formed from 4 straight lines, but the top curve of the letter was replaced by a crude triangle. I looked up into the man's eyes. His eyes were pleading with fear. He shook his head, soaked in sweat. I didn't know what to do, how to soothe him, to retreat, or to calm him down. In about an hour, 100 ways to react would probably flood my mind, but at this moment my mind was completely blank. So I did what I had to do, followed protocol. It was my job, after all, to keep things short and proper, then leave, move to the other side of the train. "May I see your ticket?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. The man was rigid, motionless. I could clearly see the veins bulging on his neck on the back of his hand, the carved symbol grotesquely contorted. We stared at each other with cold eyes, then the air shattered as if by. "No!" he shrieked, making me clench my jaw, recoiling in alarm as he clutched his head, swaying back and forth. "No, it's too early, it's too early. I haven't even had a fair chance, I'm just waiting to begin." He wailed, his voice breaking, hitting his head against the window repeatedly. My hands trembled as I reached for my radio. The man looked around frantically, glancing at the ceiling, turning to the window, arms outstretched. "Does this count? Has my journey begun?" I was about to raise the radio to my mouth when he suddenly spun around to face me. I instantly froze. He looked down at the radio, stared at me, scrutinizing me more closely, the confusion deepening the panicked wrinkles on his face. He sprang up abruptly, striking my hand, sending the radio clattering to the floor. "Are you a real ticket collector?" he hissed at me. "Are you part of this train? Are you human ticket collector?" I just stared back, speechless. The man looked at the ticket puncher in my hand, then at my still dumbfounded expression, then he clutched his head and burst into laughter. Heavy laughter that made his shoulders shake. "You don't know anything, do you?" he shrieked. "You're completely clueless about what I'm talking about. It's all too much." This madman was clearly on some heavy drugs. I glanced down at my radio, deciding I'd run straight to the locomotive. I hesitated for a second to prepare, but he just happened to remove his hands from his face, immediately grasping my intention. He lunged at me. We tumbled to the floor with a loud crash, panic consuming me. "No," I screamed. "Let me go, get off me." I punched, tried to poke my fingers in his eyes, did anything to escape, but the man just grinned manically. He pulled a knife from his pocket. I instinctively recoiled my hand to cover my throat, but he seized my wrist, pinning me down with his elbow, ignoring my cries for help, and began to carve the same symbol he had on his hand onto the back of my hand. "You lunatic!" I yelled at him, trying to twist his hand away, push him off me. But the aisle between the seats was narrow, and he braced one foot against a seat, pressing his full weight on me. His wild grin twisted. "I won't let you end my journey before it's even begun, you bastard!" He screamed at me, pressing the knife into the skin on the back of my hand, gripping so hard his knuckles turned white, ignoring my groans and struggles. He finished carving the symbol, then burst out laughing, a shrill, bitter, tired laugh, and finally loosened his grip. That's when I had a chance to shove him off. I scrambled to my feet, still in shock, clutching my bleeding wound as blood streamed down my arm and dripped onto the floor. The man just laughed. He kept laughing like a madman in the aisle, and to my horror I realized the rows of seats around me were now occupied. Everyone was silently staring, expressionless, and their eyes were all blood red. Not just bloodshot from tiredness or dyed red, but the entire whites, irises, pupils all a thick, wet red. I spun around in such terror I couldn't even scream. The lunatic was still laughing hysterically. He slammed his fist down on a nearby seat, then rolled on the floor. I turned and ran. Part 2. I shoved the door connecting the two carriages, pushing it open and looking around frantically. Some seats were still empty, but the rest were now occupied by these terrifying new passengers. Their eyes were blood red, wet as if stained with blood, and even their skin seemed to glow with a reddish hue. Veins, like they were squirming, slowly writhing beneath their bare skin, clearly visible. "Can anyone hear me?" I asked, my voice trembling, addressing one of them. "Can you hear me?" The passenger didn't reply. He didn't move, didn't show any reaction. I frantically turned to another person. "Madam, can you hear me? Madam?" I placed my uninjured hand on her shoulder, but immediately recoiled in disgust. Her clothes were soaked, leaving a slimy residue on my hand, and I suddenly realized I couldn't distinguish between her clothes and her flesh. Everything seemed to be the same reddish-gray color. I could even see veins imprinted on her clothing. Perhaps it wasn't clothing at all. "Oh God!" I shrieked, drawn by movement behind me. I turned to look through the glass into the previous carriage. The addict had stood up and was striding down the aisle, coming straight for me. I looked around wildly, desperately searching for a weapon or somewhere to hide anything. I stumbled to the end of the carriage and met the eyes of a woman, a real woman, with normal human eyes at least, and her clothes were clearly real too, like the addict's. She was sitting in a 4-seat cluster, 2 seats facing forward, 2 facing each other with a table in between. We looked at each other, and she subtly tilted her head, gesturing towards the empty seat opposite her. She looked at me, then at the seat. I noticed the same symbol on the back of her hand, the R-shaped 4-stroke letter. I turned my head back, just in time to see the addict through the glass. He was about to push the sliding door into this carriage. I stared at the woman. She tilted her head very slightly, a fraction to the left, jaw clenched, but she spoke, her voice so low her lips barely moved. "Sit down now, ticket collector," she hissed softly. "If you want to live, do exactly as I say. Sit down and shut up." I turned back to see the addict furiously kicking the door open and stepping in. And in desperation, I quickly scrambled into the seat, sitting motionless, heart pounding wildly, body trembling, hand bleeding. "I'm putting my trust in her asterisk," I screamed silently in my head. "My life is in her hands." The addict stormed straight down to the end of the carriage. I heard his footsteps getting closer, then he grabbed my shoulder. I jumped, almost screaming, but the eyes of the woman opposite me pierced me, pleading with me not to react. So I tried to suppress my instinct to respond. I was drenched in sweat but turned my head back to my original position, ignoring him. "I need to know if you're a real ticket collector," he growled at me. "Does that count? You asked to check my ticket, didn't you?" The woman opposite stared at him. She lowered her voice and snapped, "Sit down, you idiot, before it's too late. Sit down." But he didn't listen. He pulled out his knife, pressed it against my throat, and yelled louder, "Are you the ticket collector? Answer me." For a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of pity on the woman's face. "The engineers will deal with you, child," she said softly, her voice sad, and the addict froze, turning to look at her. We stood there stunned for a few heavy seconds, then heard the door at the end of the carriage being violently shoved open. The addict recoiled in alarm, releasing my collar, looking in horror at something approaching. "No," he wailed. "No, please, stay away." He held the knife out in front of him, hands trembling violently, but then his spirit broke. He turned and ran back down the aisle. I didn't dare follow him with my eyes. I was only looking at the woman, but I still saw them. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. 3 stark white, faintly glowing figures. They were slender but tall, and as they passed, goosebumps covered my skin, my teeth ached. My whole body trembled, forcing myself to sit still, listening to the footsteps of those creatures chasing the addict out the back door of the carriage. I heard the door bang, heard him shriek, then the door closed, muffling his terrified screams. His cries still echoed, long and bitter, until I couldn't bear it anymore. I tried to stand up, but the woman grabbed my wrist. For a moment, I almost gave in, but I had to resist. I needed to know what they were doing to him. I yanked my wrist free and rushed to the end of the carriage, bent down, and peered through the small glass window. The addict was convulsing on the floor. One of the 3 creatures was hunched over his back. The knife was stuck precariously in its temple. The other two were pinning his arms. These beings were too long, unnaturally long. Their bone structure seemed to defy all rules. I raised a hand to my mouth, trying to suppress a dry heave as the face of the white monster on the addict's back suddenly unfolded. White pincers, like an insect's, shot out from its face and plunged into the back of the addict's neck. A dry, cracking sound rang out. I heard it clearly, even from a carriage away. He screamed, and in an instant, accompanied by a series of snapping sounds, the monster on the left had bitten deep into his shoulder blade. It swung another blow and tore off one of his arms. I forced myself to swallow the thick, hot lump rising in my throat, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the horrifying scene unfolding on the train. "Stowaway!" The addict screamed, blood-flecked saliva foaming from his mouth. "There's a stowaway on the train. He's in the next carriage." His voice gradually faded, choked. The one holding the severed arm stood aside, clutching it as blood dripped onto the floor. Meanwhile, the other two, one still with its pincers embedded in the back of the addict's neck, continuously shoved him backward down the aisle, towards the boarding area where people usually get on or off the train. Just before the automatic door on the other side completely closed, I saw him struggling desperately, but the three monsters pushed him out of sight and threw him off the train. I saw his mangled body hurtle past the window as the train roared into the night. For the first time, I noticed that around us there were no more hills or fields. The swampy region running between Grey Castle and St. Joseph's Stand was gone. Looking out the window, instead of grasslands or mountains, there was now only an endless black desert. Low, dim sand dunes stretched as far as the eye could see. In the distance, a gray flash of light flickered intermittently. What the hell was happening? Why was my train here? This was all wrong. Everything was wrong. Damn it. Damn it, damn it, damn it. I looked back through the glass to see the three creatures approaching me. In a panic, I recoiled, almost falling, and with no other option, I rushed back to my old seat. Trembling, almost insane, but the woman opposite urgently motioned for me to be silent. I tried to suppress my breathing, though I clearly heard my own ragged, disordered gasps. "Calm down," she hissed. I heard him too. "The engineers can't identify riders themselves. You're fine, just don't make any sudden moves." "What?" She jerked her chin towards the sign above the opposite seats. I looked up, still shaking. The words were repeated, printed on a black background, running along the entire upper part of the carriage, but I had never seen it before in any train carriage. Yet now it was there, looking very old. Just simple white text on a black background, no other logos. It read, "Passengers must present tickets to the conductor. Unusual components will be removed. You must inform the engineers if you detect unusual components on the train. You must have a ticket to ride THE train. Riders will be recycled." But I'm the ticket collector. Am I a ticket collector or a rider?" "SHHH," she snapped a little louder. Just then we heard the carriage door slide open. My whole body trembled, but I tried to stay silent. I even held my breath. We stared at each other, not daring to look elsewhere. The creatures approached. I heard their heavy footsteps, then they stopped right at our table. I glimpsed their forms at the edge of my vision. They emitted a faint, pale white light. Their figures were hunched, slender, too long, with grotesquely disproportionate legs. They lingered close to us, and I couldn't stand it. I had to look, absolutely had to, just a quick glance. My eyes darted to the side and met the gaze of one of the entities. Its face was horrifying. It was long, like an insect's. Those pincers, those terrible pincers, were hidden within its folded face but ready to spring out at any moment. And its eyes, the creature's eyes, were entirely white, wide open, with no eyelids at all, no eyelids. The skin around the eyeballs was cracked and dark, as if someone had jammed its eyes straight into its skull. In the center, there was only a tiny black dot. They stared, staring deep into my eyes. Part 3. Passengers must present tickets to the conductor. Unusual components will be removed. You must inform the engineers if you detect unusual components on the train. You must have a ticket to ride THE train. Riders will be recycled. Those words, those commands, pulsed in my head, one after another, as the monster's gaze remained locked on mine. We stared at each other, unblinking. I was paralyzed. I could vaguely see the other two lingering by the table in my peripheral vision. I longed to scream. I was ready to recoil, ready to flail my arms or do something, anything. just for this disgusting monster to move, but it did nothing. The other two suddenly turned, their joints making tiny, chilling sounds, then they disappeared, gliding down the length of the carriage. After a moment, the monster in front of me slowly retreated, stood upright, then also turned and walked away on its long, spindly legs, leaving our space. I heard the distant door slide open, then close. I waited until I couldn't bear it anymore. Finally, I took a shaky breath, bowed my head, and covered my face. I tried to calm down to focus. I looked out the window, seeing the vast, charred desert stretching around the tracks. It offered no comfort. I turned back to the woman. She was still looking at me silently, with what seemed like anger. "Where in God's name are we? What's happening?" I whispered. "Be quiet," she replied. I winced, then glanced up at the sign, repeated above the seats. "Passengers must present tickets to the conductor. Unusual components will be removed. You must inform the engineers if you detect unusual components on the train. You must have a ticket to ride THE train. Riders will be recycled." "What's a rider?" I asked. "Are we riders?" She didn't answer. I looked at the sign again. What were those things just now? Why are they on the train? Are they the engineers? "Are you that stupid?" she snarled, leaning closer to me. "Didn't you get on this train? Don't you know what you're doing?" I looked at her, starting to get angry. I didn't ask to be part of this mess. Her eyes flickered down to the symbol on the back of my hand. I brought my cut hand close to her face, fresh blood dripping onto the table. "You mean this?" I said. "That lunatic carved this into my hand 5 minutes ago. What is this damn mark? Why do you have it too?" The woman leaned back, her eyebrows furrowed, but the anger in her eyes seemed to have lessened. She swallowed hard. "Yes," she finally whispered. "Those things are the engineers, but they're not smart. They don't do anything unless they suspect you're an unusual component." I removed my cap, ran a hand through my hair. The adrenaline was slowly draining, and the pain in the back of my hand began to throb distinctly. "So, am I an unusual component or a rider?" She shrugged. "Like I said, they don't identify riders themselves. Think about it, do you have a ticket?" I spread my hands, shrugging back. "Probably not, but you do." "Don't," she suddenly shrieked, jumping up and pressing herself against the seat, her sharp, panicked tone startling me. The question caught in my throat. She breathed heavily, panicked, looking behind me towards the end of the carriage, then quickly glanced down the aisle, trembling as she sat back down. "Don't," she said, her voice a strained whisper. "Please, don't ask if I have a ticket." Why not? What the hell is going on?" I ground out, trying to lower my voice but unable to hide my indignation. She pointed to the sign again. "Passengers must present tickets to the conductor. Clearly, you don't belong here," she said, "but you are some kind of ticket collector. I don't know if that rule applies to you, and I don't want to be a test subject. Ask this one." She flicked her finger towards a passenger sitting across the aisle. Red-skinned, sitting ramrod straight, bloodshot eyes motionless. I felt uneasy. "You think that's a good idea?" I asked softly. "You want answers, don't you? Ask him." Trembling, I leaned across the table, cleared my throat. Excuse me, sir, may I see your ticket?" At first, nothing happened. Then the red man began to move. His movements were stiff and strange, like a machine. He raised an arm, extending his hand towards me. Between his fingers, embedded deep in his flesh, mingled with veins, appeared to be a ticket. Looking closely, it was indeed a ticket, but it seemed to be molded from his flesh, inseparable. I tried to lean closer, but only dared to a safe distance. There were no letters or characters I recognized on it, just distorted shapes, broken semicircles. The passenger lowered his hand back to its original position, and I sat back, stroking my chin, my mind in turmoil. The woman looked tense again, her expression a mix of fear and pity. "I don't know who you are, ticket collector, or why you're involved in this, but you really should go. I'm sorry, but please go somewhere else." I pressed my lips together, licking my dry upper teeth. Go where? Will the engineers grab me if I leave here?" I leaned closer as I asked, making her flinch back against the seat, eyes wide. "I'm sorry," she whispered. So I stood up. I wanted to say something to her, a thank you or a reproach. Should I be angry because she was practically kicking me out? After all, she had only given me questions, not answers. But no, she had saved my life anyway. "Thank you," I whispered. "Good luck." She offered a faint, strained smile, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Worried, I left the carriage, passing through the compartment where the addict and I had struggled, stepping over thick puddles of blood, the strong, metallic scent of it filling my nostrils. I held my breath, bent down, and picked up my radio. I tried to turn it on, but there was only a lifeless, buzzing sound. Still, I clipped it to my belt and pushed the door into what should have been my original carriage, except it wasn't my original carriage anymore. It had changed. The seats were arranged identically, but all emergency signs were gone. All announcement screens were gone. A moment ago, when I stood up and put away my phone, a tiny glimmer of hope. I reached into my pocket, intending to call for help, but the screen was shattered. It was broken. I pressed the power button, held it down, but nothing. Damn it. I put the broken phone back in my pocket, glancing around the carriage. Some seats were empty. Some had those red-skinned passengers sitting silently, unblinking, perhaps not even needing to breathe. The only sign they were alive, or at least existing, were the pulsating veins beneath their skin, if that was indeed skin. I shuddered and looked out the window, seeing only desert. A bizarre black desert, dotted with low hills and distant mounds, and gray flashes flickering on the silent horizon. I looked up at the sign board. Passengers must present tickets to the conductor. Unusual components will be removed. You must inform the engineers if you detect unusual components on the train. You must have a ticket to ride THE train. Riders will be recycled. What the hell does recycled mean, recycled? All right, that's enough. I needed answers. I had to find my way back. If I saw the engineers, I'd duck under a seat. I could do this. I could do this. I started walking, my courage still intact, down the aisle towards the front driver's compartment, only there was no driver's compartment, just more carriages connected. Carriage after carriage, I kept walking through them endlessly. Many empty rows of seats, many rows with red-skinned people. At one point, I encountered another person. I was sure he was human, a teenager. He also had the same symbol on the back of his hand. I tried to talk to him, but he avoided me, never once looking at me. Every time I tried to make eye contact, he turned away. I told him I didn't want to hurt him, didn't want to ask for his ticket. Just mentioning the word ticket made him whimper pitifully. Finally, I helplessly left him. I walked on, from one dark carriage to another. On the ceiling of each carriage, there were dim lights installed. Some carriages were clearly lit, most were dim. Some only flickered on and off, then off. And sometimes, no lights at all. I was forced to rely on the faint light from the windows at both ends of the carriage. I hadn't encountered the engineers again yet, but I was constantly tense, always expecting them to appear. After a very long time, I must have passed 30 carriages or more. Finally, I saw a new sight, a man sitting by the window. He wasn't the red-skinned type, nor did he look human, at least I didn't think so. He shimmered vaguely, more like a thick shadow than a distinct figure. No facial features, just a dark, deep purple shape, its surface swirling between layers of deep purple and absolute black. The dim light from the ceiling cast a strange, unnatural glow on him, like water but thicker. Perhaps I stared stunned. "Hello," I called softly, moving a little closer. The person, if indeed it was a person, didn't reply or move. I didn't know what to say, or if he could even hear me. "Do you know anything about this train?" I asked, my voice low. A long, thin shadow darted across the carriage floor, making me jump. My hands clenched, trembling, but I looked around and saw no one. Then another shadow glided past, followed by a third. The fourth, slower, looked like insect legs, just like spider shadows crawling across a lamp. The light overhead flickered. I looked up, and a creature clung to the ceiling, then lunged down at my face. Part 4. I didn't get a clear look at the monster as it lunged. It seemed to be made of the same material as the shimmering, distorted man I'd seen earlier. It looked like a crab or a spider, about the size of a large cat, maybe even bigger. I screamed, squeezing my eyes shut, using all my strength to push the nightmare creature off my head, sending it flying down the aisle before I fell backward onto the train floor. Horrified and disgusted, I watched it soar for a moment before landing with a soft, wet splat. But it quickly righted itself and scuttled rapidly towards where I lay sprawled. I screamed again, scrambling to my feet, using the seats to pull myself up, staggering backward. 1 step, 2 steps, while the crab spider monster crawled close behind. I spun around and ran headlong into the front carriage. The scuttling sound of many legs scraping the floor made me want to vomit. I glanced back, horrified to realize it was wrapped around my leg, hissing horribly around my ankle. I swore frantically, kicked my heel hard, sending it flying as far as possible. It flew again, but I didn't bother to see where it landed. I kept running, panting. Just then the train tilted slightly into a curve. I felt it clearly through my hasty steps. Looking out the window, I saw the other carriages appear in my vision. For the first time, I vaguely understood the enormous length of this train. Carriage after carriage, one after another, the train curved, but the end, if there was one, never appeared. It just kept stretching into the desert. Through a window, I caught a glimpse of white light flashing, seemingly 4 or 5 carriages ahead of me. Damn it, the engineers. It must be them. I must have been too reckless, too stupid. I stood still, trying to regulate my breathing, looking around. I turned back. Was the crab spider still following? Maybe. Could it get through the door if it closed? I didn't know, but the engineers definitely could, and they were heading this way. Gritting my teeth, I made a decision. I dropped onto an empty seat next to a motionless red-skinned passenger, my face turned towards the direction I had just run from. I forced my breathing to slow, trying to be as still as possible, as if wanting to sink into the seat. The carriage door burst open with a slam. My heart pounded wildly. I held my breath, dead silent. They moved very fast. I heard their footsteps clearly, and they appeared. 2 of them this time, sickeningly tall, glowing. But they strode straight through, not bothering to pay any attention to me. They disappeared through the opposite door. I remained seated, waiting, counting to 10 before I dared to breathe again. I waited to see if any more followed. Then I left my seat, crept to the door, and peered through the small glass window. On the other side of the carriage, the engineers were pursuing something the crab spider. It was scrambling wildly under the seats and climbing the carriage wall. One of the engineers stretched out a long, gangly arm and lunged for it, but missed. Its elbow hit the back of a red-skinned passenger's head, but the passenger didn't react. The horrifying insect scrabbled wildly across the luggage rack and disappeared, then reappeared through a seat. One of the engineers crouched on all fours, like a dog, though it looked more like a praying mantis, then suddenly thrust its head forward, pincers shooting out from its face and plunging into the crab spider's back. I heard the monster scream from where I was. Its legs thrashed wildly as the engineer dragged it towards the side exit door of the carriage. The other engineer violently pulled the door open. Its pincers snapped and tore off one of the spider's legs. The creature shrieked, then was thrown off the train into the wilderness. I saw it tumbling through the window, still thrashing, as the train roared away. In horror, I tiptoed back to my seat and waited, silent, hoping the engineers would leave. But they didn't come back through my section. After a while, I edged towards the door again, looked through the glass, and saw no sign of the engineers. They must have moved on, further up the train. I returned to the shimmering man's carriage. It turned out there were more crab spiders like this on the train. Great, another terrifying thing to watch out for in this hellish place. I glanced out the window at the scenery. The black sand stretched into scattered small hills. Low, black rock cliffs, then something large, like a gigantic tree trunk, flashed past the window. Another, a little further, then a third appeared. They were indeed gigantic tree trunks, like redwood trees but many times larger. The bark was a featureless dark gray, the trunks reaching incredibly high into the night. If I pressed my face against the glass and looked up, I saw white leaves, or rather needles, far above. The ground around the base was covered in a thick layer of needles, gradually turning gray against the black sand. More and more colossal tree trunks whizzed past, dozens, hundreds of them, the thick gray-white needle carpet gradually obscuring the black sand. The forest of colossal trees stretched as far as the sandy area had. I turned back to look at the shimmering man in the carriage, my mind in turmoil. He wasn't like the red passengers, not quite human, very unique. Maybe he could give me some clues, if he could talk and I desperately needed information. "Hello," I tried again, softly. "Can you hear me?" There was no reaction. Strange currents of light still danced continuously across his featureless form. I cautiously placed my hand on his shoulder. It felt incredibly strange, like pins and needles. I recoiled my hand. If I ask for your ticket," I bit my lip, anxious, "what will happen to you?" But he still didn't move, didn't respond at all. Perhaps he was like the red passengers, no help at all. Still, I spoke. "May I see your ticket?" At first, nothing. I stood still, waiting for his arm to lift or some reaction, but saw nothing. I sighed in frustration, about to leave, when suddenly he began to convulse. Unusual spasms rippled from his chest to his shoulders. I backed away, clenching my jaw, thinking to myself that I had probably made another mistake in my search for answers. And just a few seconds later, that apprehension vanished. His body twisted, then ripped open. From the top of his head down to his waist, he tore open, bursting and splitting into 4, 5, 6 squirming crab spiders. "Damn it all!" I cursed, panting, trying to keep my voice from becoming a shriek. I staggered backward, kicked one of them, then swallowed my curses and yelled, hurrying through the door into the small connecting compartment between 2 carriages. In the corner of the compartment, a fire extinguisher was mounted in a wall recess. It was incredibly heavy, heavier than any fire extinguisher I'd ever known. But I still managed to lift it, panting, waiting. The compartment door closed, and then a monster squeezed through the gap. I growled, put all my strength into bringing the extinguisher down, delivering a fatal blow. A loud thwack and squelch, and the spider shrieked, writhing on the floor, one of its legs still twitching wildly. I lifted the extinguisher again, slamming it down as hard as I could, crushing the creature underfoot. I felt a wave of nausea, but I held it back, staring at the still-moving slime. Exhausted, I leaned the fire extinguisher against the wall with a clatter, wiped sweat from my brow. I didn't scream, or at least I tried to keep my voice down. But would this commotion attract the engineer's attention? The loud commotion behind me made me look through the glass. Now 4 engineers were furiously searching the carriage, their pincers snapping repeatedly, tearing seats apart as they snatched at the screaming crab spiders. One of the engineers looked up. It looked straight through the window and drilled its eyes into mine. My heart leaped into my throat. I groaned softly, unconsciously. I had forgotten how chillingly they stared. Unblinking, with wide-open eyes, it took a step down the aisle towards me. I immediately flung myself away from the door, spun around, gripping the handle of the train toilet, and slammed it shut. My heart pounded as if it would explode, hands trembling as I slid the lock. I pressed my ear to the door, listening nervously. For a moment, there was only the distant screaming of the crab spiders, then the sound faded. Another long silence, and I heard the carriage door slide open, a soft click, heavy footsteps. They stopped right in front of the toilet door. Cracking joints and then a knock. Knock, knock, knock. I held my breath, my heart beating like a drum. They definitely heard me, I was sure of it. I tried to stay motionless, but the knocking came again. A little louder this time, slower. Knock, 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 damn it. Please, please go away, don't look for me, I just want to go home, that's all. I never wanted to be involved in this. Another terrifying silence passed. I felt as if the engineer's hand was withdrawing from the door, lifting, hearing the rush of air through its grip, as it was about to knock a third time, louder, more urgent. But instead of knocking, I heard a scream. A woman's scream, seemingly young, muffled by the door but still very clear. There was no third knock. Instead, I heard the characteristic cracking of the engineer's joints, heavy footsteps suddenly turning, and they stormed through the door into the next carriage. In the distance, I heard a commotion, desperate screams for help. It lasted for about a minute, then suddenly the screams grew louder, closer, and I heard the compartment door slide open. A girl's desperate plea echoed, poignant, mixed with the horrifying cracking sounds of the engineers. Clearly, she was being dragged, pulled along. I heard thumping, punching, or kicking sounds hitting the toilet door where I was. I jumped, then the girl's screams were dragged further and further away through the train carriages. I heard the screams, the terror fading into the distance. I sank onto the toilet seat, head in my hands. I'm such a coward. I should have done something, helped her. But how? Fight all the engineers alone? Still, I could have tried, couldn't I? They would have thrown me off the train, or worse. I don't even know the rules here. Besides those bizarre rules plastered all over the carriage, I quickly glanced. I was a coward. I glanced at my watch. It had been over 2.5 hours since we left Grey Castle. Impossible. The stretch between Grey Castle and St. Joseph's Stand only took about an hour. But clearly, we were no longer on a normal route. Nothing was normal anymore. I didn't know where I was or where the train was heading, but hiding in here was useless. I slightly opened the door, cautiously peering out. No engineers in sight, only the mangled remains of the crab spider, the fire extinguisher leaning against the wall, and trails of blood extending to both sides of the carriage door. I swallowed hard. I thought about taking the fire extinguisher. I tried to lift it again. And I could, but it was heavy, terribly heavier than a normal fire extinguisher. I looked at the label, wanting to see what was inside, but only saw strange symbols, all broken lines and jagged circles. Finally, I returned it to its place, groaned softly, and with nothing else to do, I continued my journey through the carriage. The carriage with the shimmering man was now in tatters, covered in black and purple slime on the glass, ceiling, luggage rack, and floor. Many seats were ripped apart, shredded. The red-skinned passengers still sat there as if nothing had happened. I moved to the next carriage, then the next and the next, carriage after carriage. The giant trees outside the window gradually thinned out. The ground began to crack, revealing small, dark green puddles, then larger ones, these pools connected by streams and rivers. Fewer trees, more water, rocky edges, and then the land disappeared. Surrounding the train now was only water, deep, dark blue water, a vast ocean stretching to the horizon. The sky was still pitch black, but the lightning flashes no longer flickered across the horizon. I watched, stunned and horrified. The thunder and lightning now swirled in the clouds, rapidly circling and disappearing. It repeated every few seconds, the sky revealing strange arcs of light. They illuminated the dark water, rippling very gently, almost imperceptibly. I lingered for a moment, then moved on. The wind grew louder as I continued. It sounded like the wind whistling, getting stronger and stronger until I pushed the door into a carriage and my ears were filled with a howling gale. I stood there, mouth agape in shock. The upper half of the carriage had completely disappeared. The next carriage ahead was intact, blocking some of the wind, but the draft was still very strong on my face. I pulled my cap tighter, took another step. Clearly, this carriage wasn't designed like this. The jagged metal edges of the ceiling were torn, broken glass, fragments of metal, and shredded seats were scattered across the floor. Very few seats remained in this carriage, many had been ripped out. There were no passengers here. Without walls and a ceiling, I had a wider view of the scenery. Looking down, I saw the train running on a very narrow bridge, only about a meter above the water, perhaps only a few tens of centimeters. Still, all around was water. I looked up at the sky, thick black clouds swirling, colliding, mixing, and pushing through the night. Occasionally, a circular flash of lightning would appear, running in a circle, then extinguishing in a strange gray glow, illuminating the edge of the slowly swirling clouds. Dizziness almost overwhelmed me, so I quickly bowed my head, gritted my teeth, and hurried to the next carriage. Fortunately, that carriage was intact. Then the next and the next. Finally, I saw a figure ahead through the glass door. I stopped, bending low, alert. It was an old man, seemingly human. He had just emerged from the toilet compartment and stepped through the carriage door. He staggered down the aisle, then grabbed a seat rail and slowly sat down, his back to me. I gritted my teeth, then decided to follow, gently pushing the sliding door. I cleared my throat as I approached. "Hello. Excuse me." The old man jumped, exhaling sharply, turning to look at me, at my uniform, at my face and eyes. We stood in silence for several long moments. "Hello," I repeated. "Good evening." "Evening," the old man replied, then asked, "Are you the ticket collector, son?" I wasn't sure how to answer. "Yes," something like that. "Are you going to ask for my ticket then?" "No," I shook my head, "not if you don't want to." The old man snorted, then seemed to let out a great sigh of relief. He gestured for me to sit in the seat opposite him, across the small table. "Sit with me for a while," he suggested. I nodded and sat down. The old man closed his eyes slightly, mumbled something, then made the sign of the cross over his chest. I didn't miss the detail of the symbol carved on the back of his hand. "Are you sure you don't mind talking like this?" he asked, his voice low, his eyes glancing up and down the aisle. "Aren't you worried it's too much?" The old man shrugged. "As long as we keep our voices steady and don't make a fuss, in my experience, it should be fine." I bit my thumbnail. "Experience, sir, how long have you been on this train then?" He scratched his chin, looking out the window at the vast expanse of water. "Well, probably 7 or 8. 8 years, 6 months if I'm not mistaken. Quite a long journey." I stared at him, bewildered. 6 years, 6 years and 8 months? I forced a laugh, but he didn't join in. "You're joking, right? You said you've been on the train for over 6 years." The old man nodded. "That's right, son, 6 years and 8 months, he said softly. "And you?" "Me, but what do you mean? My shift started at 9:00 this morning. But I've only been here a few hours. I have no idea what's going on. Don't know where the train is going. I didn't want any part of this. Some madman carved this symbol on my hand." I tried to suppress my emotions. "Is this mark what brought me onto the train? Is it because of this symbol?" The old man listened to my outburst silently, then gently replied, "Yes, son, that very symbol. To get on the train, you must have that symbol carved, clear as day. And of course, you can only board the train somewhere between the two stations, between Grey Castle and St. Joseph's Stand." "But that's ridiculous," I exclaimed. "The Grey Castle to St. Joseph's Stand line only takes an hour at most. Not 6 years. That line connects to Manchester via Newcastle. It should end in Edinburgh after about 2 hours, shouldn't it?" The old man shook his head and sighed. "Manchester, Newcastle, Edinburgh, I don't know those places, young ticket collector." I raised a hand and gently tapped my forehead. I took a deep breath. This old man seemed kind and was helping me. Getting angry wouldn't do any good. "But your accent, you're British, aren't you? You must know those places. England, Scotland." But he just gave a sad smile and slowly shook his head again. "I'm afraid I've never heard those names, young man." I drummed my fingers on the table, looking out the window, where the train still silently rolled along and the dark water rippled, looking like nothing so much as the edge of this realm. Part 6. The old man spoke again, breaking through the vague thoughts in my head. "This train can take you through the gaps, young man. It can take you further, far, far away." "How far, sir? Where are you going?" I asked. I didn't understand how any journey could last 6 years. The smile faded from his face, his eyes heavy with sadness, then he turned to look out the window, silent for a long moment. After that, he sighed, reached into his jacket pocket and fumbled for a photograph. It was a young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, with a very bright smile. "I don't want to bore you with a million details, and anyway, I don't know how much you'd comprehend, young ticket collector. This is my daughter, a truly wonderful girl, though she's a bit peculiar." He let out a soft chuckle, then winced. "She was obsessed with occult things, very dangerous, truly dangerous. She got involved with some shadowy figures and then she disappeared, vanished entirely from this world. So that makes it 20 years now. If you count the 6 odd years on this train, then it's 26 years. Though between you and me, I'm not sure time here passes at the same rate as the outside world." His expression darkened. "I promised myself I'd do everything I could to find her. What kind of father would I be if I didn't? So I started researching the very occult things she loved, both the dark corners, the hidden sides, the twisted paths that weave through the cracks." He clenched his trembling fist, lowering his voice. "I will find her, young ticket collector. I will see my daughter again. I've been searching for all these years." He wiped his reddened eyes with a bony finger, then looked down at the table between us. "And my journey now is nearing its end. I'm glad I got to talk to someone before I left the train." "Left the train?" I was surprised. "What do you mean?" "My station, young man. It's time for the train to stop and let me off." I leaned forward, my heart pounding with both worry and excitement. "Your station? You mean the train will actually stop?" "Why, of course," he chuckled. "If it didn't stop, it wouldn't be a train, would it?" "Right," I mumbled, sitting back, my mind racing. "Sit with me a little longer," he suggested, seeming calm, but I could tell he cherished the company. In truth, I was grateful for him too, so I nodded and smiled, continuing to sit. As the train crossed the vast ocean, we quietly told each other a little about our lives, our work, our families. He spoke of his daughter, and I told him about mine. My fear of calling her, the divorce, and the feeling of disillusionment with life. As I poured it all out, I suddenly felt so pathetic. But the old man was patient and understanding. He didn't say much about his hometown. I tried to ask where he was from, what city, what kind of town, but he didn't answer clearly, nor did he ask me the same. I had the feeling that we weren't allowed to discuss that topic, so I let it go. I only managed to glean one clue. He had indeed boarded the train between Grey Castle and St. Joseph's Stand. He seemed convinced that those two stations were within the same large city and were only about 10 minutes apart in a straight line. Those words sent a shiver down my spine. Perhaps he realized it too, because then the conversation shifted to our surroundings. I asked him about the engineers, hoping to get some clues about their horrifying appearance, their stares, their purpose. I asked about the passengers, the shimmering man, the crab spiders. The old man said he had seen many engineers, though he didn't know much about them. He witnessed them throwing countless people off the train. They always took a part of the victim before throwing them off. Sometimes an arm, a leg, or something worse. As for the shimmering people and even larger, more terrifying forms, he had also seen the engineers dispose of them outside the speeding train, but he had never witnessed them touch the red-skinned passengers. Those silent, vein-covered, bloodshot-eyed individuals were always ignored, never even looked at. He had also encountered crab spiders. He saw them crawling on the ceiling and seats in the dark, and he said they became denser closer to the front of the train. But he himself had never been all the way to the front of the train and knew nothing more about its true purpose or nature. The sign above became our topic of discussion again. Passengers must present tickets to the conductor. Unusual components will be removed. You must inform the engineers if you detect unusual components on the train. You must have a ticket to ride THE train. Riders will be recycled. What does recycled mean? I asked. Sir, what's the real meaning of recycled here? I don't know, young ticket collector, but it scares me. Just the thought of being caught as a rider without a ticket is terrifying enough. And every time I look up there, I'm reminded of the burden of guilt I carry. I asked him what he meant, and he continued. I had a friend on the train a few years ago. We met in a carriage and became acquainted. He was a good man, trying to find a way to heal the chaos in his mind. He gently tapped his temple. He thought very logically, but was plagued by terrible nightmares. One day, we were sitting and chatting when a conductor suddenly appeared, shimmering and strange. Not like you, but the actual conductor of this train, something horrifying, and it demanded my friend's ticket. Of course, he didn't have one. The old man's face suddenly looked older, more tired than ever. A profound sadness spread, making me feel sorrowful too. That conductor lingered near us for less than a minute, then disappeared down the aisle. Before that, my friend had never seen a conductor so close, and it was my first time too. I myself had never been asked for a ticket. So we just sat there, frozen in horror, not knowing what to do next. Then the engineers came. The last thing he said to me when they stormed into the carriage, the last thing he said as he gripped my hand, was to please stay silent, not to give them a reason to throw me off the train. Then they grabbed him by the collar and dragged him away. And I never saw him again. Now I have to live with that torment every day. Here, there's only time to think. To think if I did right or wrong, if I could have saved him somehow. But my daughter is my priority. It's for her that I started this journey, young ticket collector. And I will find her. I swear by all that humanity reveres. I swear. The old man made the sign of the cross again, whispering a prayer under his ragged breath. I was silent, thinking for a while. The light at the end of the carriage flickered, and the train wheels still clicked on the tracks, making me shiver with a strange, distant fear. Then I asked him if he knew a way to get home. One step at a time, son, he replied softly. Just then, a voice rang out from an invisible speaker in the carriage, a crackling sound. We are approaching Care CD. Care CD. Then the sound faded, leaving only a faint crackle before dying out. Ah, we're here. I'm getting off now, the old man said, slowly standing up. He was short, his voice showing the weariness of age, but at this moment he didn't look old or weak standing before me. His chin was held high, jaw clenched, hands fisted. An arc of lightning swept across the dark gray sky outside the window, casting a silver light on his face. And I saw in his eyes a persistent will that filled me with admiration, a strong empathy. I too stood up unintentionally, standing awkwardly beside him. What should I do now? Hug a stranger I just met 20 minutes ago, ask for contact information? But he smiled kindly, extending his hand for me to shake. I reciprocated. I followed him to the connecting compartment between the two carriages, where the doors for boarding and alighting were. Just then, the train slowed down, very gradually. Outside the door, a rocky island appeared, bleak and rugged. The island was made of slick black rock, chilling to look at. Jagged, distorted mountains rose high into the sky, surrounded by piles of jagged rubble. The train came to a halt, and the crackling speaker said, Care said. The old man lightly patted my shoulder, then pressed the door open button. The sliding door hissed open, and he stepped onto the dark gray ground below, walking across the wet stone slabs to enter that ghostly island. The door closed. I watched silently through the glass as his figure gradually grew smaller in my sight. Then, after a moment, the train hissed softly again and began to move. I watched him disappear completely, watched the rugged, saw-toothed mountains glide past the window, gradually sinking into the dark water. The clusters of sharp rocks thinned out, further and further, and then once again, there was only the sea. I realized I was experiencing a strange but profound sense of loss as I watched the white arcs of lightning twist across the sky over that ocean. Looking up at the series of signs running along the ceiling of the carriage, passengers must present tickets to the conductor. Unusual components will be removed. You must inform the engineers if you detect unusual components on the train. You must have a ticket to ride THE train. Riders will be recycled. And I continued my journey forward. Part 7. I continued my journey along the train. My plan now, I supposed, was to find real people, talk to them if possible, gather any clues in hopes of finding a way back. Who knew, maybe I'd be lucky enough to meet someone who also wanted to go home like me. But for the next 3 hours, I didn't encounter another human soul. I mean human, because I still saw countless silent, red-skinned passengers and a few shimmering figures faintly visible. I even saw another crab spider scuttling across the carriage ceiling. A cold panic ran down my spine, but I forced myself to stand still, breathing rhythmically, and it scurried into the overhead luggage compartment. Of course, I didn't linger. I found some water to drink from old, half-empty plastic bottles discarded under seats and in trash cans. I don't know where they came from. They didn't taste good, but it was better than nothing. I also tried drinking water from the sink faucet in the restroom. Sometimes it was fine, but mostly it was full of slimy scum that made me nauseous. Strangely, I didn't feel hungry, though tiredness kept creeping in. I stopped to rest in a relatively empty carriage, sitting by a window seat and looking out. The flickering ceiling light gave me a few seconds to see the ocean landscape. Then suddenly, I only saw my own tired, worried face reflected in the glass. The surface of the sea was now dotted with large, floating rocks. Further out, I saw a silvery gray sandbank gradually approaching, curving into an arc. On the land, there were some pillars or stone columns, but too far to discern their shape, unable to tell if they were artificial structures or natural formations. Then the light overhead went out. The hair on my arms stood on end. A deep humming sound resonated down the aisle. I slowly turned my head, lips pressed tight, and saw a grotesque, larger-than-human figure hovering above the floor, slowly drifting across the carriage. It was a conductor, the real conductor of this train. I knew because I had asked the old man about their appearance before, and this creature matched the description. It was terrifying to see it directly. My instincts screamed to run. A shimmering, undulating gray-white mass, several slender, long arms ending in curved fleshy blades, with no human characteristics at all. It stopped right next to me and my brain screamed. Should I run or fight? If it asks for a ticket, what should I do? Risk attacking or flee? Bolt through the emergency exit, regardless of what's outside? I quickly glanced out the window. The train was hurtling across the sea. Could I survive jumping out if I hit a rock, or if I was lucky, swim to shore? But what other creatures lurked in the water? 100 thoughts tangled, then a deep voice from the monster boomed, echoing through the carriage. A ticket inspection is required to verify the validity of the journey. Although those words made my heart clench, I felt a slight relief because it wasn't speaking to me asterisk. I saw no mouth, couldn't even tell which way it was looking. But I understood. I couldn't explain why, just thanked God that the horrifying conductor wasn't addressing me. The red-skinned passenger in the opposite seat stirred. She slowly, stiffly raised an arm, and right on her hand, connected to her fingers by a layer of skin, was the ticket. One of the conductor's slender, writhing limbs touched the ticket, stamping it with the exact same symbol as the carving on my hand, leaving a faint, thin wisp of smoke rising from the impression. The female passenger lowered her hand, and the conductor continued to glide out of the carriage, through the door to the next one. I exhaled, feeling my heartbeat return to normal, then decided to follow from a distance. Keeping a safe distance, I saw it drift into the next carriage, demanding tickets from 2 other red-skinned passengers. After stamping them, it slowly glided to the carriage behind. I quietly followed, peeking through the glass window. The conductor stopped next to 3 humans huddled together. All 3 looked utterly terrified, paralyzed with fear. The conductor's voice boomed again. A ticket inspection is required to verify the validity of the journey. Silence. Then a woman began to tremble, sobbing uncontrollably. The other 2 remained motionless, stunned. The conductor lingered for about a minute, then, instead of going through the door to the next carriage, it gradually disappeared in place, fading as if dissolving. The woman burst into tears, collapsing, burying her face in her hands on the table. The woman next to her paled, staring down at her friend. The man opposite slammed his hand on the window in frustration. I stepped into the carriage, clearly hearing his voice. Just a little more, just a little more. We'll reach the next station and we'll be free. Just about an hour more, what's there to be afraid of? Just jump already. Jumping out is certain death, the other woman said, her voice trembling, gripping her sobbing friend's arm. I glanced behind me, looking through the window, and saw the engineers about 2 carriages away, approaching. You all need to decide quickly, I urged, and they looked up at me, noticing my presence for the first time. The man growled, leaping up, standing between me and the 2 women. It's not them, the woman with glasses shrieked. Look at his hand. I quickly glanced back. The engineers were very close, just 2 more carriages. They're coming for you, I warned, stepping past the man and gently touching the shoulder of the crying woman. Especially you, maybe all 3 of you, you have to leave the train, it's better than becoming their meal. Are you insane? The woman with glasses hissed. Do you know what's out there? The man beside her lowered his hand, his voice softer. But he's right, he said, still looking behind me. It's come to this, we have to jump. Sooner or later they'll throw us off anyway. Get up. He grabbed the crying girl, pulling her towards the door. Oh God, damn it, the other woman muttered, standing up, trembling violently. I calmly sat down in a nearby seat. Just a few seconds later, the carriage door burst open with a crash. The engineer's heavy footsteps pounded. Get out of the way, the man yelled, trying to open the emergency door. The wind howled, rushing in, roaring through the carriage. He turned to the woman with glasses, cupping her face. Go, please go. You fool, she cried, pushing him. You jump first, jump and I'll follow. But the man didn't jump. The engineers had already stormed in. He took a deep breath, gripped the woman's shoulders, tensing. He yelled in her face, then shoved her with all his might out of the train, towards the water below. The train was moving too fast, I couldn't even see her hit the water. He spun around to pull the crying girl, but it was too late. The engineers had him restrained. I could only clench my fists, seething with guilt and pity as I watched them struggle. The man wrestled with 2 engineers, who dragged him around the carriage. They slammed him into seats and corridor pillars. He roared in pain. The other girl initially only had to deal with 1 engineer, and with some incredible strength, she pushed it back towards the open door. The man, also held by an engineer around his neck, stumbled back, so the whole group, including the engineer near the door, tripped over each other, knocking the monster out into the open. Pincers flashed for a moment but only snapped at air. The engineer fell off the train and vanished. The girl turned, intending to pry off one of the remaining 2 engineers clinging to the man, screaming, but froze as the monster deployed pincers from its face, biting deep into his shoulder. He roared for her to jump, but she was stunned. The second engineer, clinging to the back, scuttled along the rail and carriage wall, seizing her, locking her tight, ignoring her struggles as blood gushed across the floor, splattering the engineer's legs and staining the man's chest. The one holding her turned its face, extended its pincers, bit into his side, and ripped off a chunk of flesh with a gruesome asterisk thwack asterisk. He gurgled something, and the engineer behind him, still biting his shoulder, braced its legs on the handrail, shoving him out the train door. It slammed the door shut, cutting off the howling wind into the carriage. Horrified, my heart felt like it would explode, watching the engineers continue to drag the girl, who was reeling. One monster clamped onto her, and she punched frantically at their bodies. Catching my eye, she shrieked, "Help me, please, help me!" I cowered in my seat, terrified, but the engineers ignored her. They dragged her towards the front of the carriage, through the door to the next carriage, ignoring her screams and struggles. And I decided. I thought quickly, thought about the old man and our brief conversation. I clung to the last bit of courage I had, and I stood up, staggering to my feet. As if my legs had a will of their own, I walked down the aisle. I will follow her. I will act. Part 8. Passengers must present tickets to the conductor. Unusual components will be removed. You must inform the engineers if you detect unusual components on the train. You must have a ticket to ride THE train. Riders will be recycled. I could only surmise that the woman, the one I was now following, was going to be recycled. I didn't know how horrifying that would be, but she must have been a rider like the previous group and had been identified. I weaved my way down the aisle, keeping as quiet as possible. She saw me following, but the engineers didn't. She was screaming, yelling, kicking, and struggling, and I just prayed that in her panic, she wouldn't reveal my intentions. The engineers dragged her down the carriage, to the next carriage, and then another. But at the connecting compartment between two carriages, they suddenly stopped. I flinched, almost tripped, stumbled into a nearby seat, and held my breath, watching to see what they would do. I squinted. One engineer traced its thumb around the door-open button, instead of pressing it directly, just a crude circle, but the button suddenly glowed a faint red. It pressed the button, and the door sprang open, except the view beyond the door wasn't what I had just seen through the window earlier. I watched in astonishment as the engineers stepped through. I only managed to grasp a few brief seconds. The far wall was reddish-pink, the floor looked wet, and something was squirming. The woman shrieked, trying to cling to the edge of the door as she was dragged away, but the door slammed shut with a faint hiss, and she disappeared. Looking through the glass, I only saw the next train carriage as normal. I stood there stunned, but then I got up and hurried forward. I peered through the window, seeing no sign of her or the engineers. I pressed the button, the door opened just to the next train carriage. Some seats had red passengers. I waited for the door to close automatically, then bent down and looked at the button. All right, nothing ventured, nothing gained, right? Come on. I mimicked the engineer's action, drawing my thumb around the edge of the button. Sure enough, the button glowed a faint red. I took a deep breath, pressed the button, the door slid open, and I stepped through. The view outside the window was essentially the same as before, only the sandbank was much closer. What drew my attention now were the walls of the train carriage. They were indeed reddish-pink, the floor was soaking wet, dark, and sticky. The lights here also cast a red hue, just like stepping into a dark room. The air was thick and heavy, everything felt weighty. I could clearly hear my own breathing. I took another cautious step. The seats in this carriage were all occupied, mostly by red-skinned passengers, some by the dark, shimmering kind. At the end of the carriage, through the window, I saw a faint white light, meaning the engineers were still close. I quickly moved down the carriage, trying to gather what little courage I had left, searching for some makeshift plan. Should I suddenly attack the engineers, or pretend to be an official ticket collector to trick them? In my haste, I tried not to notice that the carriage walls seemed to be pulsating, contracting and expanding rhythmically as if breathing. I continued to the next carriage. Along the aisle, pale arcs began to emerge from the reddish-pink walls, pressing against the strange material of the walls. Like supporting bone structures, perhaps. Their color was white, or maybe it was just the bizarre red light that made it hard for me to tell. I continued to the next carriage, then another. Fewer and fewer red-skinned passengers, and instead, more shimmering ones. Among them, horrifyingly, some were no longer human-shaped, looking like giant lobsters. Huge, strange, but still perfectly silent. I gritted my teeth, trying to push through, and the more I went, the clearer I saw that those white arcs were not ordinary support beams. They looked like ribs arching up to the ceiling, pressed between the oozing, vibrating wall sections. The sight was utterly disgusting, making me want to vomit. The air here was thick, and the white light at the end of the carriage suddenly flared, then grew even brighter, revealing the silhouettes of engineers approaching. Damn. A group of them was rushing this way. I looked around, desperate. In this section of the carriage, there were no empty seats to pretend to be occupied. Nowhere to hide. Trying to stay calm, I retreated a few steps, turning back to the connecting compartment behind me, looking around for a toilet to hide in, but there was none here at all, not even a fire extinguisher or anything to grab for defense. With no other option, I pressed myself into a corner, clinging to the wall, head bowed, my heart pounding. I waited for the door to burst open and 4 or 5 engineers to rush through, their elbows swinging, hunched figures lumbering towards me. But one of them paused, observing me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw its wide, inhuman eyes scan my body, but I clenched my fists, holding myself still. Fortunately, after a tense moment, the engineer turned and continued to glide after the others. I breathed a sigh of relief and continued on my way. I no longer saw the engineers ahead, but I still followed that direction, passing through the damp carriages. The windows grew smaller and smaller, gradually with each carriage, until finally the windows disappeared completely. In one carriage, I realized with dismay, there were no seats, no passengers, only 2 gigantic fleshy masses thumping, moving up and down like 2 organs. The pounding was deafening. I had to squeeze through the narrow gap between them to get through the aisle. It was hot, humid, sticky against my skin, utterly disgusting. but I gritted my teeth and kept going, not knowing what else to do. In the carriage ahead, white light flickered through the glass. The engineers were there, though they didn't seem to be approaching this way. 3 carriages separated us, then 2, then 1. This carriage was exactly like the previous fleshy ones, also full, but only a few red-skinned individuals, mostly the dark, shimmering type, larger, bloated forms. Their figures were indistinct, disturbed by swirling layers of dark, hazy colors. I peered from behind the door, looking ahead at the most horrifying sight I had ever witnessed on a train or anywhere else. I had to quickly cover my mouth, shivering, almost unable to breathe. Perhaps this was the front of the train, the cockpit. I saw no more doors in the distance. This chamber was twice as high as the regular carriages, pulsating, glowing red. Filthy black fluids dripped down the walls and floor. A few meters from me, I saw 2 people pinned to the wall, utterly unable to move. One of them was the woman I was looking for. There were about half a dozen engineers in the chamber, one of them holding something in its hand. I had to suppress a retch as I realized it was a freshly severed human arm. I watched it throw the arm towards the center of the carriage, or perhaps the locomotive. Horrifyingly, that central point was a gigantic mouth clamped onto the train's frame, surrounded by nerves, red tendons, and taut, gruesome skin connecting to the ceiling, floor, and all 4 walls. Around its lips were rows of bloodied teeth, chattering loudly. It groaned, a hoarse, mechanical sound. The mouth crushed the arm into a pulpy paste in an instant, dark liquid flowing profusely onto the floor. I froze, watching 2 other engineers grab the young man standing next to the girl, shaking him and throwing him into the monster's mouth. I flinched, squeezing my eyes shut, but it was too late. I still managed to see him being seized by the monster's jaws, crushed amidst desperate screams. Nausea surged, and I struggled to suppress it, trembling, my stomach churning. Oh God, this is hell. Do I have any chance? How can a pathetic, useless wretch like me fight this hell? How can I save that girl, damn it? I muttered, tearing at my hair, trying to rack my brain for a plan. I looked back and stared straight into the wide, lifeless eyes of another engineer. Part final. I stared into the engineer's eyes. It lunged unexpectedly. The pincers clamped onto its face began to vibrate. I screamed, staggering backward into the locomotive chamber. "Ticket collector?" A faint voice called from my right. It was the woman, grabbed and pulled violently from the wall, her arms twisted behind her by an engineer. My eyes darted around, I lost my footing, slipping on the damp black trails on the floor. More engineers emerged from the walls, cracking their joints, screeching wildly, lunging at me. One of them clamped onto my right arm from behind. The giant mouth let out a hungry roar. I had to act now. I feigned hesitation, giving a little ground to the engineer gripping me, then suddenly mustered my strength and shoved hard. Though I didn't completely dislodge it, it was enough for it to slip from my arm, tearing my sleeve. This allowed me to lunge forward, colliding with the engineer in front of me, sending it stumbling back into the previous carriage. Taking a deep breath, I lifted my head, roaring as loudly as I could, directing my voice towards the carriages behind, putting all my strength into my voice. "Attention, all passengers. I, a legitimate ticket collector on this train, demand that you verify the validity of your journey. One by one, present your tickets now." At the same instant, I felt sharp pincers sink into my shoulder blade, a piercing, suffocating pain that left me no breath to scream, and they dragged me back into the locomotive chamber. In a moment of horrified confusion, the carriage behind seemed to freeze, then chaos erupted. The scattered red-skinned passengers obediently raised their hands, displaying their tickets. But the bulging, distorted shimmering figures almost simultaneously burst open into countless squirming, screeching crab spiders, none alike. Some were big, some small, some looked more like lobsters than crabs, but all shrieked deafeningly, crawling across the ceiling, floor, and carriage walls. A few crab spiders charged into the locomotive chamber. Instantly, the pincers embedded in my shoulder snapped out. I fell to my knees, groaning in pain, watching the engineers scramble, throwing themselves at the crab spiders swarming the ceiling and floor. Some squeezed into the rear carriage, while others wrestled in the locomotive chamber, chasing the monstrous creatures. The giant mouth roared in fear. I scrambled to my feet, gripped the woman's hand tightly, and dragged her, running through the compartment as fast as possible. Colliding with the engineers, I gritted my teeth, enduring the disgusting sensation of cold, slimy crab spider legs brushing against my skin. Then we both struggled, running through carriage after carriage, leaving a bloody, chaotic battleground behind us. We ran headlong, and I knew they would follow. The train began to slow. Both of us stumbled, skidding to a halt. I slammed my shoulder into the wall. The girl did too. "It must be your stop now," I gasped, my back aching, calves burning. "Yes," she panted brokenly. "Yes, it is." "Then go." I struggled to push open the emergency exit, groaning softly in pain. The wind howled. Outside was a gray-white sandy ground below, and in the distance, rows of broken stone pillars and strange conical towers whizzed past. Maybe we should wait for the train to stop completely," she hesitated. The crackling public address system announced the station name in a long, drawn-out, indistinct hiss, like a shriek, and I forgot it almost as soon as I heard it. "You have to jump now," I urged. "They're almost here. Do you want to risk being caught by them? Your friends? Maybe they survived being thrown out." She nodded, trembling, and stepped onto the edge of the door. Although the train was slowing, it was still fast enough to make the jump very risky. She turned to look at me, offering a faint smile. "Thank you, ticket collector." I was exhausted but smiled back, then she turned and leaped out. The train was moving too fast. I didn't get to see her land, but it was sand outside. At least it would be soft. She'd be all right. I slammed the door shut, glanced back, saw no engineers, but they would definitely be hunting. I staggered through the carriages again, my legs like jelly, suddenly wondering if I had to go all the way to the front, or could I use the trick of pressing the carriage change button? I tried it at the connecting compartment to the next carriage. I rubbed my thumb around the edge of the button as I had done before. This time it glowed a faint white. I pressed the button, the door opened, and on the other side there was no more heavy red light. The walls were back to metal, no flesh or bone, and the windows were large and clear. I breathed a sigh of relief, though I wasn't sure why. Of course, the engineers could still follow, but I still felt a little safer. Many seats were empty. I collapsed into one, exhausted, gazing out the window as the train came to a complete stop. My shoulders and arms now throbbed with sharp, intermittent pain. The public address system crackled, announcing the station name, but it was a name I couldn't remember. I sat still, saying nothing. The train sighed, shuddered, and continued its journey. I lingered for about an hour, sometimes crying alone. My phone was still useless, and the radio only buzzed with static. Finally, I struggled to my feet and walked along the train, not knowing where I was relative to the front of the train, if that was indeed the front or relative to my old carriage. So I just kept walking. I walked on until there. I saw another conductor, the real kind of the train, hovering in the next carriage. After many hours of thinking since leaving the tense locomotive chamber, a fragile plan had formed in my mind, but perhaps it was better than nothing. Because, after all, I was also a ticket collector. If I encountered a passenger without a ticket, how would I handle it? At least I had some basis. I had nothing left to lose. I approached the conductor, my heart pounding like a drum. If it failed, I was ready to run. I would jump off the train, however dangerous, rather than let them drag me to that monstrous mouth. Just the thought of being crushed filled me with dread recycled. I stepped through the door. Before I could hesitate, I spoke calmly and clearly. "Excuse me, conductor. I wish to change my journey if possible. I just want to go home." The conductor hovered right in front of me, its undulating flesh shifting gently. Its deep hum made my teeth ache, but I held my stance. It was silent for a moment, then spoke in a deep, booming voice without a mouth. "Your journey cannot be changed, passenger. The journey has been marked." My heart leaped into my throat. I wanted to retreat, afraid it was about to ask for my ticket. But I needed answers, I needed hope, so I asked again. "Then can I buy another ticket?" "I want to modify my journey, conductor." The answer was identical. "Your journey cannot be changed, passenger. The journey has been marked." Marked, my journey had been stamped. The conductor began to glide away. I stepped aside, letting it pass. It drifted into the carriage, stopping to demand a ticket from a red-skinned passenger. She raised her hand and the conductor stamped it. Marked. It stamped the symbol, the exact same mark as on my hand, onto the ticket, and onto the passenger's skin. I looked down at the symbol carved on the back of my hand, the R that Madman had carved. That was my journey's mark. Then a crazy idea, one that made me sick, flashed in my mind. But it was the only idea I had. Waiting for the conductor to vanish, I continued down the carriage, my heart heavy with grim determination. I walked for hours, then more hours. Occasionally, I'd see a group of engineers and hide. I encountered a couple of people, they refused to speak. The red-eyed, red-skinned ones remained expressionless. The strange, shimmering ones drifted by. I dragged my feet, exhausted, terribly sleepy, but I forced myself to keep going. No stopping, just walking. My steps were heavy, my muscles aching, but I didn't dare look up. Outside the window, the scenery had long changed. The train climbed, soaring high through the night sky. Giant wind vortices and glass structures roared and swirled in the distance. Dark clouds billowed ominously. Then I saw something familiar. The roofless carriage, jagged walls, missing seats, empty. The wind howled, and I had to cling to a seat, tears streaming from my eyes as the wind lashed at me, looking at the giant tornadoes outside. I didn't dare go to the edge of the carriage, but I still glanced, wanting to see if I could spot the ground. Nothing. I continued through a carriage smeared with black and purple streaks, ripped seats, twisted railings, traces of the old struggle. Further on, I saw a compartment with a fire extinguisher, misplaced, reflecting the flickering lights. Exactly where I had left it, next to the squashed crab spider corpse. And so I came to the carriage where I had met the teenager. He was now gone. Finally, I was sure I had returned to the starting carriage. The dried bloodstains on the floor, smudged on the seats, were unmistakable. The place where the madman had carved that sinister symbol onto my hand. Thinking about it, perhaps he wasn't an addict at all. He was just as bewildered and terrified as I was, but he was still a bastard. I knelt down, searching the floor. When the engineers dragged him out, his knife was still stuck in his head. But when they passed by where I sat with the woman, the knife was gone, which meant they had taken it or it was still somewhere on the train. I checked every seat very carefully, nudging the red-skinned ones with my foot. Then, in the darkness, I found it. The knife. I grabbed it, pulled it out, my heart pounding. The plan, which had only been theoretical until now, had to become action. I leaned back against the handrail along the aisle, flipping the blood-stained knife over and over, looking down at the symbol on the back of my hand, the R mark of the journey. If I still had it, I would never get a ticket home. Just as that conductor said. To be honest, at first, I thought of chopping off my hand entirely, but after all this walking, I doubted if such an extreme measure was necessary. Thinking of another way, I tore off a piece of my sleeve, wrapped it into a tight bandage, biting it to prevent myself from screaming loudly, then trembling violently, I began to drag the blade across the back of my hand. A groan escaped me. Everything went black before my eyes. It was incredibly difficult. I climbed onto a seat near the window, opposite a cold, emotionless red passenger. "What are you looking at?" I muttered to it. Blood dripped, wetting my hand. I bent my head, pressing the blade deeper, deeper still. I had to gouge out the entire wound, erase the carving completely. Erase the mark. I cut and sliced. Many times my hand trembled, the blade dug deep, thick black blood gushed onto the small table in front of me, spilling onto my jacket, my shirt. I felt terribly dizzy. But I had no other choice. I told myself I had to do it. So I kept cutting and carving, gritting my teeth, my groans muffled by sweat. Gradually, the back of my hand was mangled, flesh and skin torn and twisted, but finally the carving was completely gone. I tore off another piece of my sleeve, wrapped it tightly, screaming in pain as I tightened the cloth, wiping sweat from my forehead, trying to catch my breath. Then I sat and waited for a very long time. It was 3 weeks later before I encountered a real conductor again. I walked around, asking the red passengers if any of them hadn't been stamped yet. Whenever I saw an unstamped ticket, I'd stay nearby, watching. Then the familiar hum sounded. I jumped up, saw it gliding closer, and approached. "Conductor," I said softly, the decisive moment had arrived. "I want to purchase a ticket home, please." For a moment, it didn't respond. Then its voice resonated around my head, even though the creature had no mouth. "To which station do you wish to travel?" I held my breath, all my fears surging. "I want to go to St. Joseph's Stand in England," I tried to articulate clearly. "On the line that starts in London and ends in Edinburgh. That place." It paused for a moment. "The fare is 1 year and 1 month. Do you accept?" 1 year and 1 month? What did that mean? Lose 1 year and 1 month of my lifespan, or stay on the train for that much time? But why was I still questioning? This was my chance to go home. I couldn't let it go. "I accept," I whispered. The conductor instructed me to raise my hand. I offered my cold hand. It touched it with a pale, writhing limb, and my hand immediately felt a stinging itch, like a slow, dull bee sting, uncomfortable but not sharp. A ticket gradually grew between my fingers, the skin stretching, printed with letters like a part of my body. I grimaced, watching it appear. "Passenger, please be seated," the conductor said, then glided away. It disappeared into the next carriage without another word. I looked at the ticket growing from my hand, exactly like the ones I had seen on the red passengers. The same strange characters, broken circles. LCKB 90. My seat number, I supposed, so I walked back in the opposite direction from the conductor, searching for the designated seat. It took several hours. Then I reached it. I sat down and watched the strange, ancient landscapes roll past the window. I sat like that for a very long time, a very, very long time. Just me and my thoughts, mostly about how I had been a poor father, husband, and man in the old world, and the scenery churning past the window. I remained on the train for 10 months. It's almost the 11th month now. Countless things have happened to me during that time. It would take too long to tell, perhaps another time. Once, I met a little girl. I showed her the ticket growing on my hand. She asked if that method would work for people not in the railway industry. I didn't know, but I helped her cut off her R mark at her request. She cried so much, we were afraid the engineers would hear. But fortunately, they didn't. She calmed down, thanked me, then left to find the conductor. I never saw her again. There's one more thing you might find interesting. I once saw the red passengers move all at once. Oh God, it was terrifying when they suddenly all stood up without warning. I almost jumped, gripping the seat tightly, watching them turn like robots, silently moving towards the door, veins bulging as they waited for the train to stop. The plexus speaker boomed, "Cole Stump, we have arrived." The train burst out of a long tunnel, hurtling into a blood-red mist. It was filled with taut, skeletal fibrous structures, bony, segmented towers, and a distant, hazy mountain. Countless strange lights ran along the fibers, thousands, tens of thousands, scattered under an unsettling red sky. The passengers all exited the train in chilling silence, yet radiating an air of utter despair. I even saw some of the shimmering ones leave too. The train stayed at this station much longer than previous stops, long enough for a multitude of new passengers to board, also silently, with bloodshot eyes and vacant faces, sitting in their designated places. Then the doors closed and the train moved on. I thought about that scene day and night, but I couldn't understand it. After such a long journey, I believed that 1 year and 1 month was the time needed to go home. But that hypothesis shattered when my station name was suddenly announced over the speaker, less than a week before the 11-month mark. I immediately sprang up. Adrenaline surged. Did I hear wrong? No, I definitely heard it right. Exactly. The train is approaching St. Joseph's Stand, England. Yes, the United Kingdom. St. Joseph's Stand. The speaker announced, then died. My heart pounded. I was fully awake, my eyes wide, looking out the window. The hills. Oh God, I saw the familiar fields and overgrown grasslands. My line, my route. I wanted to jump and scream but forced myself to suppress it. Silently, I moved towards the door, trembling with anticipation. The train slowly decelerated, and I heard the gentle tap of rain on the carriage roof. The train stopped completely, and with trembling fingers, I pressed the button to open the door to the platform. Journey's end. I stepped onto the platform, immediately feeling the cold night air of the countryside, and looked up, letting the rain hit my face. And I jumped, spinning in a circle, laughing aloud, yelling, whooping. The most joyful laughter I had ever made. I knelt and touched the wet concrete. How long had it been since I touched something like this? Then I looked at my hand. The hand holding the ticket, the thin skin ticket, gradually dried, crumbled into dry flakes, and was carried away by the damp breeze. I looked up and met the eyes of the only other man on the platform. He wore a hooded leather jacket, smoking, leaning against a low pillar of the shelter. "Are you all right?" he asked. After a few seconds, I ran to him, excited. "Can I borrow your phone, mate?" My voice was choked with joy. "I'm home. I'm back, I'm back, I'm back. How could this rundown, dreary station be so lovely?" He looked at me silently, exhaling smoke, observing my scarred hands, my torn, blood-stained jacket, my eyes which must have been wild. No, I'm afraid not." He rummaged in his pocket, pulled out a coin, and tossed it at my feet. "Get yourself a hot drink, mate." He took another drag from his cigarette, smirking. The train behind me started up, rumbling, moving away towards the next station. Still beaming, I lunged, grabbed him by the collar, and slammed him against the pillar, making his cigarette fall onto the wet ground. I leaned close. "That wasn't a request, mate," I growled through clenched teeth. The man paled, offering his phone with trembling fingers. I released him and stepped back a few paces. "I'm not stealing it," I reassured him. "I'll give it right back, just a second." He nodded. I walked a short distance away, dialed my daughter's number, and put the phone to my ear. It rang, and she picked up. "Hello, Eli, can you hear me?" I said. "Dad," she said, startled, her voice groggy with sleep. "Why are you calling so late? Is something wrong? Are you still at work?" "No," I said. "I just wanted to tell you I love you. I'm okay." I smiled, certain she could feel my beaming smile through the phone. "And I'm actually not at work anymore." I unclipped the radio still on my belt and threw it onto the tracks. It shattered. "I just quit my job."